It takes a few minutes to buffer. You're drinking tea, I'm drinking coffee.
I've had enough coffee to send me through the roof. I speak at double speed if I drink too much coffee. I sound like a nut job.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to part 2 and my fascinating conversation with David Murrin, global forecaster, polymath, and all-around good guy, somebody who really, to me, in my opinion, absolutely understands the big picture better than anybody else, but has got this fascinating threaded background of actually trading, exploring, doing military historian, geopolitical forecaster, macro trader, just one of the most fascinating individuals. And I know he's present, so it sounds like I'm blowing smoke up his ass. He's actually one of my favorite people, because there is something so much deeper to David Murrin that goes beyond his own need, not only for significance, he's got plenty of that, recognition, he's got plenty of that, money, he's got plenty of that, but a deep desire to actually serve humanity, and serve humanity with his skills, with his experience, with his scar tissue. And I have this phrase of advice that I give to people: weaponize your scar tissue, and David Murrin has done that with flying colors. So I want to get into part 2, where we're really taking the investor perspective today, because you need to stop trading time for money. And the only way to do that is to actually invest in things that extrapolate the amount of time and money that you have and create a product where 2 + 2 = 22. And the only way you do that is by actually skating to where the puck is going to be, not where the puck has been, or where the puck is right now. So your understanding of geopolitical macro cycles, long-term cycles, big picture, small picture, trading opportunities, and not letting emotions fuck you up along the process is absolutely critical to me. So let's get into that. In part 1, we really discussed the big picture and why the West is not adapting, and how we are literally stuck in this tremendous decline. But David, where do we go as investors? What should investors inspect? Where do we go?
Let's start with kind of the mapping out of, say, the 7 big macro sectors. And let's look at equities. Equities were inflated by a massive money printing series of cycles for 20 years. First moment money printing came about was after 9/11, when they wanted to shore up the economy, and they were like, well, that's really quite, well, that worked. And then by the bottom of 08, it was like 10 times, 3 times, 10 times. We got to like 40 times by the end of it. Crazy. And so I was able to predict using price models to within literally 1% of the higher than NASDAQ. And for all the people that follow my work, they're short still from the higher than NASDAQ with a 1% risk. That's a considerable return. The first thing I'm going to say is the bubble process is dead. We are in the deflation of what I call the doomsday bubble, because it's a bubble that comes at the end of the declining phase of empire, where you literally inflate your assets because you have no underlying productivity. And once the bubble bursts, it never goes back. So that high is going to be there for 10, 15 years in real terms. And now we may be pausing right now and say technology may be perceived to be a safe haven against everything else, but it's a pause before the next leg down. If you look at the Russell 2000 and a true indication of the generic economy, that is one sick puppy. And it's also not being manipulated by the Fed. Now, what I'm about to say is not a conspiracy theory. It's like how systems behave. When they've tried money printing and that doesn't work, they are into emergency straits. And I remember it was a trading experience I'll never forget. And that was Argentina was like the belle of the emerging market world. If you wanted bonds, you owned Argentina. And then there was this particular phase where Argentine bonds didn't go up and Brazilian bonds carried on up. And I remember thinking that's just weird in itself. But maybe there's a swap of the leading baton. And then I could see the peak of Brazilian bonds. And I kept thinking, oh, well, if Brazil's going to reverse, Argentina's going to crater. So we put these trades on at 84. And Bear Stearns are brilliant. We were first in the repo stack. And everyone said, are you crazy? And I said, no, they're going to default. And this was right at the high. And they were like looking at me like I was a madman. And lo and behold, things started to go really badly. These bonds go to 50. And what does the government do? It says, oh, Mr. Pension Funds, we're going to create a law that makes you buy our bonds. So now the pension funds buy the bonds and they go right up to 77. Now, as a trader, I felt like my balls had come up through my mouth. And luckily, we were the first in the repo stack. So everyone else got peeled out. And then the things puked and we bought them back at 15. Now, what's going on in the States right now is actually a sophisticated version of it. Because the Fed encouraged banks to put 25% of their assets in long-dated bonds because someone had to buy their bonds, inverted commas, just like the Argentines. And then lo and behold, what do? They do it as the bond market tips over. And we'll come back to the main reason is inflation in a normal contractive cycle. If you overlay 1950 to literally 2000 with 75 in the middle is a hump roughly. And somehow, I don't fully understand how, but I think it was globalization and basically Chinese industrialization keeping inflation lower predominantly. Basically, inflation turned around and it looked like it was actually going downwards over that period. So this sudden blip is actually a mean reversion to where the pattern should be. It's just beginning. And the beginning, the engines of that are not demand, as most people drive themselves to think. It's supply side constriction through two elements. One is war and the competition of resources. And secondly, everything that China did make for us is coming back in our face. And the reorganization of that supply chain is going to be so inflationary. So that's inflation. Don't believe a word of the linear thinking federal governors across the central banks who think this is an aberration.
It's funny, as you started on that discussion, a black cat crossed behind you and crossed our path, which
that's Felix. He's actually a lucky bastard, so don't worry about that. And so the engine, so they would get back to money printing, but inflation won't let them. And so now you find the Fed belatedly responding to inflation because it's their main mandate, but they're raising rates, but they have other liquidity mechanisms that actually counter that. And only in the States has inflation come down. In Europe, it's record highs. The feedback loop is now really kicking in. So bond markets, start to roll over and they are going to go miles. If there's anything to go by, 10-year rates, if you just took the 75 peak model, CPI was 15%, 10-year rates of 15%, and Fed funds are 22%. I keep thinking that's what we're dealing with into 25. Probably worse, to be honest, because it's just a worse situation. But just use similar peaks as a measure of what we are facing. So one of the things the Fed are trying to do right now, and you can see them doing, they're trying to sort of not put up rates too much because it'll blow the banks up, because half those banks have lost all their capital. And if you made them market to market, they'd all be bankrupt in one go. It says, how do you force a hedge fund to be market to market, but your bank can hold it to maturity? It's just ridiculous. So you've got this ridiculousness, and the only thing that's saving the big banks is the rush from the collapsing medium-sized banks to the depositors to increase their assets. That's all. That's it. And you're going to end up with the most enormous consolidation into a few banks by the end of it.
It's happening at JP Morgan right now as we speak. And, just Credit Suisse UBS example was perfect. Okay, we're going to give you that. You take them,
I mean, JP Morgan should be renamed the One Bank, because that's ultimately where it'll probably end up. There's 4,000 banks into one. But whatever they think they're doing by papering over the crack, and I do actually think, and I know legally they're not allowed to do this, but I think they have learned to manipulate the S&P, because the S&P is the mood barometer. And if you dampen down the S&P, the whole market complex dampens down. So we're into some form of control that we've never really seen before. Free markets don't exist in some sectors. So they're trying to make the yield curve invert, and there'll be a bond pop. The risk of a bond pop is high before it really pukes, because it helps the bank's ALM books. And they're trying to control volatility in equities. The dollar's going bye-bye. Why is it going? Because essentially it was a dollarized world. And now you've lost half of it to the UN bloc, which is building around autocracy. That itself cuts your sources of revenues down considerably. So that marginalization means that this is the terminal fall of the dollar. And
never mind all the political stuff that we discussed in the.
I mean, all the other stuff is it's all at once. But the underlying reason, if you're a global currency-based empire and half the world says I'm not part of you, you are going to suffer, especially when you're overextended and over-indebted. You can't compensate for that. So we're into that phase, coupled with the details on top. So consider the dollar to be too big for them to control. That one's not controlled. consider gold and silver, which is another currency not to be controlled, and consider Bitcoin not to be controlled. So where do your safe havens lie? If you're an individual, if you don't, see things short term and you want to put something on that in 2 years' time, I think that you might come back and not want to kill me because it's worked. Without it's quite simply like precious metals portfolios with cryptos, because cryptos are going to be another safe haven for the window they exist before they're broken by quantum computers. It's just as the whole currency system blows, the dollar loses it. So those three things are your safe haven. If you're smarter,
David, one quick question. I know that's an hour-long side conversation, so let's not do it. But most people are lulled into they buy precious metal portfolios, but they're still held by paper in a bank, and it's just it looks like precious metal, but it ain't. So maybe we should do that in part 3 of how you actually execute on it.
I'm happy to. Look, in short, you're right. There's 2 Olympic swimming pools of physical gold, which has to be, all that paper fiat money has to be put into it, which will send it through the roof. But there will be a time where the paper gold money is as liable as, paper other stuff. So that's when the bullion, the physical paper is going to spread, is going to go. So how you hold it is a discussion. In early stages, you can do it. And actually, probably if you're cautious, you get more leverage by doing it. As it moves up, you can change that pattern. So you'll have time.
I love the Zurich Cantonal Bank version of that, where they would hold physical bullion certificated by the Zurich Cantonal Bank, which is itself underwritten by the Swiss government. Do you know what I mean? So it's like a double whammy, that if you're going to hold some paper that is attached to gold, that's what I take it. But I've got some friends that have created some phenomenal bond-like instruments in the gold markets where I'm like, this might be quite interesting.
If I was, as a bond investor, I would have bought every single precious metal convertible bond I could find. It's a no-brainer. I think the mining stocks are interesting because they are physical. They own physical things in the ground, as long as their reserves are accurately priced. So that's a nice way of doing it. And they are super volatile. You don't have to buy much when it's right. I remember I owned them from 2000 to 2002, and although we made an absolute killing on stuff, you're talking about 50, 100 time returns. So you don't want, if you don't like volatility in the early stages, you scale in because it'll,
I've always, was it Mark Twain's example of like what a gold exploration stock is, a hole in the ground with a bunch of liars looking down. Anyway.
There is a whole version of that, right? So that's why it's quite careful to say, make sure the reserves are as they claim. But they are in the ground and they are present. And I think also the other issue that's not, Africa is almost lost to the Chinese and Russians unless we get our fingers out. What's happening to South Africa is incredibly significant, in that you've got the white population who are completely allied to the West, and the ANC who, with their communist, guerrilla, are actually beholden to the CCP and Russia. We should have been awake. And Cape Town itself, or the Cape, holds one of the great trade routes. If you shut off the Suez Canal, which you've got to assume in a conflict, both canals will be sabotaged one way or the other. And so you're going around the Cape of Good Hope and the Cape of Horn. Suddenly the Falklands become a very important piece of real estate, and suddenly so does the Cape. So what's going on in terms of the implosion of South Africa and intervention by the West to secure it is a really interesting, I've written a lot about that, but it does affect gold that comes out of South Africa, some other African countries, and we will have to have a campaign to control Africa and prevent Russian and Chinese resource acquisition when the conflict goes like fully global.
China has completely recolonized Africa without shooting a single bullet.
Absolutely. Their only problem, Anric, is they can't secure the blue water trade routes from Africa to their shores. So although they've done it, actually in a conflict, they'll be locked out. And at the moment, now, 5 years' time, when they built 500 ships and their blue water navy sails out from the second island chain, we'll get run over because we won't be in that state. But for now, and for that period when they needed to build the ships, there will be a strategy to lock off the trade routes with submarine capabilities. And suddenly the Africans can default on all the Chinese debt they want, and it'll be a much more Western place. But it needs an active campaign to do that. So gold, silver, and precious metals. There is another thing that I think is worth considering in terms of the physical world of business and activity. And that is, if this scenario comes true, and I see nothing to me on the optimistic side that actually is going to stop it, At best, for a short period, we'll see global bifurcation, and at worst, because surprise is critical, like action, which creates bifurcation as a secondary product. The Western economies are going to have to shift to wartime command economies. That means making pink frou-frou shoes probably isn't going to be really productive as the consumer shrinks. But having facilities to make unique contributions to the war effort, that could be really, really powerful. So I think if you're going to be an investor on a thematic, raw resources inside the Western domain, gold, silver, and wartime constructs, like a broken down automated factory that could be bought and repurposed, that's an interesting opportunity. So I'd be thinking along those lines in terms of where to go. What you don't want to be is run by fund managers and the fund business that is index linked. So all your long stuff, you just don't want it. And you're really, really, really not sure you want any manager you have has to be an alpha generator and not a beta generator. And because of the upward trend in the majority of things over the past years, most of them will be beta orientated. So that whole presentation of where unique will survive, I wouldn't trust it as a skeptic.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting way. I mean, as an investor, I've always thought more like a systematic CTA, right? And talking about dyslexics, I mean, some of the best systematic traders I have ever found were in some way either severely dyslexic or slightly like me. You know what I mean? So I've always tried to take human emotion away from the investment decision, because I think as humans, we suck at that. Our emotions just get in the way of making investment decisions. And right now, I think we're back at one of these inflection points, because I call them the beta chasers, all that leveraged beta that has essentially, I mean, they classified themselves as hedge funds, but it was really rented leveraged beta, right?
Yeah, that's all it was.
For so long has rewarded these little empires that have been built, whereas the real investors have actually languished behind. I see a total flip in that trade again, because
so I think the value of alpha generating traders and investors is now skyrocketed. And the reason I keep thinking about this, I met Stelmar at a course in London, and he's obviously the great pit trader that created a distribution pattern for the way markets behave. And he said something that is stamped on my forehead. And he said, I've been in the pits for 50 years, and every 10 years, my group of friends changed. And I thought about that. And it was because the environment changed and they didn't, and I did. So he built in a system that was adaptable and saw the change and went with it. And I think now we are one of the great watersheds of change between the past 20 years and now. And 20 years is a long time for stability, by the way, so it makes it even harder in the shift. And so the trouble with systems is all the systems will be operated for that piece of time. But as the shift happens, systems lose money because they have to readapt and they don't have enough historical base to operate. So I think there's a huge space outside the parameters of many systems and their boundary conditions for really adaptive, alpha generative risk takers to make a killing.
So talking about places to hide, because I'm an offense player, always have been an offense player. I don't play defense very well. And I think as an investor, you have to obviously do both, because if you can have the greatest offense ideas, but if you don't figure out how to protect them and hold on to them, you don't live to fight another day. And the same, I think, goes from the macro environment at the moment. So my brain keeps going, where do I hide, right? Well, hiding is not going to make you the money that you need to make, right? So obviously, you're a fan saying, okay, precious metals, I get it, right? And I think maybe in part 3 or part 4, we could really actually get into that. Where else would you go right now?
Okay, so I gave the strategy for the everyday person and what they would do with their money. As a risk taker that loves a really has always thrived in great contra-trend, powerful down moves, I am drawn to being short equities at the critical moment, because that will be huge. I mean, I had a lot of fun in individual equities in the rut 2000. In fact, many of the equities in the top 20 size were rolling over way before the index did. It was the most incredible series of warning trades. So I love something that can make enormous amounts on the downside. Bonds will produce. So here's a thought: if this happens, war breaks out, bond markets are going to absolutely disappear, because where do you fund your war effort from? With the issuance of bonds. So don't think bonds are going to be a safe haven. It's the opposite. And in fact, the best example is British bonds into 1914. And Archduke Ferdinand got shot and nothing happened. In fact, people were completely optimistic. It was just a one-off event. And then suddenly you could see this confluence of events towards war. And the day war happened, it dropped 50%. Because suddenly you're into 60% of a GDP a year on defense, and you have to get it through the issuance of bonds. So bonds are not a safe haven, they're an opportunity. Coupled with the inflationary dynamics of that conflict, I am drawn to that trade when the time is right. I'm drawn to the equity trade. I'm drawn to the dollar trade. Now, they're the offensive trades that let you make, as a trading person, picking some of these big declines like Argentina and the 01 highs and the 07, 08 declines, and all of those I've been a part of, the flash crash, or every single one I've seen. This is a career defining moment, because I don't think we're going to be a fully capitalist system by the end of this.
No,
I think this is the end of the system as we know it, and it will be replaced by some sort of centralized command system that gets us through the trauma, hopefully, of fighting off autocracy. What comes next will morph back into it at some stage, but immediately afterwards, it will be a very different system. We'll be capital constrained. People won't trust freedom of markets in the same way. The interventions of central banks would have completely discredited them. So how do you then actually control the system? You start with a different organization with different selection, but there's a lot of things that come. So this is a sort of at the end of a chapter type opportunity, I think. And if you're running offense as someone with capability, those are trades which I've found myself hunting for.
Wow. I mean, I think it's such a dangerous terrain right now, whether you are a little person with your pension fund assets, right? I see some of those could be wiped out by 40-50%.
Henrik, I think we're about to see the great lie for a generation that worked, put their money into the pensions, and thought that
and real estate and property.
Real estate is absolutely on the cusp of an implosion. The leverage across real estate in the UK and US it's an accident waiting to happen. And strange enough, if it goes down in a positive inflationary environment, that's doubly really weird. How does that happen? Well, the bottom line, it happens is because everyone's forced to sell because they can't maintain their loans. And with a glut which saturates the process, glut has to work through before it becomes a counter-inflationary asset. So I agree with you. I think really all of the things that people take for granted in their long-lived, hard-working lives as they come into retirement now are about to be taken away from them. And the resentment and the frustration that goes with that in society, and the story that you have safely invested in our large pension fund organization is going to be really a source of a great deal of aggravation.
I think we need to switch to real safe havens at the moment, and let us talk about real briefly, because I know you have an important dinner coming up. And let's switch channels to a fun subject of your beloved Setawayo. She was originally called Zulu, right?
It's quite. You're exactly right. It was very ironic because I think the other thing, funnily enough, is I was conceived on my father's boat. I was sailing from months into life. I was 11 before I sort of clocked on that other people didn't sail. I so took it for granted. And sailing is a multivariable environment, and sailboat racing, which is something I'm truly passionate about, at the back of the boat, involves multi-dimensional decisions, whether it's your boat, your crew, the optimization of the boat, the waves, the wind, the rest of the other fleet. The back of a boat is always lateral, and the front of the boat tends to be more process-driven. And so it's a very interesting parallel from my passion and my work. They have a lot of overlaps and a lot of crossovers. And Setaway was launched in 57, and she's slightly older than me by 6 years as a result. And my father said, buy a boat for life. So there was 25 when I bought this 50-foot wooden boat, which was big in those days, completely renovated it, thought it was going to be something of a way of life. And I used to race on the national windsurfer team. So I was a competitive racer through windsurfers at the cutting edge of their arrival. And suddenly another wooden boat appeared. I said, why don't we have a race? And that was the problem, because now I was hooked. If you're going to race to win. And I've spent 30 years evolving her into probably one of the most sophisticated 17.5-ton, 50-foot boats you'll ever see. And one of the things I really love to see is how a group of people come together. And a great example was at the weekend. It was a crew of individually really talented people, not worked together, boats very complicated, different from their experience. And so our first races were punctuated with some embarrassing, non-professional actions like spinnaker pole wasn't down enough and little things like that. But what I really loved about this team is every lesson was learned. And literally by the third race, they were almost like on it, really on it. And the next day, it was like we'd become one organism. Mm-hmm. And one of the things and I think this is a lesson for people in any kind of group activity. There's a theory on my site about human systems. And I define humanity as a spectrum of 100 people, and 15% on the right-hand side are innately productive and constructive. Mm-hmm. And they tend to be your leaders, your entrepreneurs. They build things with their own energy. There's a gap in the middle, which think of people that basically will be like wheat in the wind, and they will orientate towards the people they're closest to. So if they're led by positive people, they become positive. But if they're affected by negative people, they become negative. And then on the other side, there's 15% of what I call a malignant energy. It's pretty cloaked. And one of the things that, from experience is dark energy is not obvious. It doesn't turn up with horns. It turns up with a halo. It gets through your screen, presents itself as vital to you, and then wreaks havoc. So there's about, of the 15, there's probably, 13%, for example, that oscillate between a semi-state, and they make appearances sometimes just at the worst moments. But then there is 2%. That 2% will take down whole businesses. Mm-hmm. And I keep thinking about Star Wars. You have all these Jedi, two Sith, right? And the reason why negative energy works is because the universe is entropic and the barrel is always going down the hill. So it takes 10 of you to push the barrel up and one of you to go poof, and it's going too fast. On a boat, when you introduce one of those people, the whole functionality of the team just disappears. And I often see it as one person's energy stands up above others. And the moment that happens, they're drawing energy from the team to them rather than being part of it. And so sailing boats and teamship and how you build, we self-organize as humans. So as long as there isn't the negative side, we'll sit together and say, Henrik, what else can you do? I'll do this, you do that. We naturally do it. And so 80% of the population will constructively self-organize if you get rid of the other 20%. And the trick is to identify them. And right now, we've got a Xi and a Putin who firmly sit in the 2%, about to go and take the world down the plug hole. And we're sitting there going, oh, well, he won't do it because we think he thinks like us.
Yeah, he doesn't.
He is a predatory. They are both predatory humans that think completely unlike us. And to understand them, you need to study them like you do an animal. Completely different process. And one of the things about dictators I find fascinating is they tell you what they're going to do before they do it. Mein Kampf said everything about Hitler. You just had to read it and believe he was going to do it. And you had forewarning. Putin said he was going to do it. She said he was going to do it. This isn't a surprise, but it is to a healthy person because we don't operate like that. And if the world became more aware of that difference, we'd be a better place.
One of the quickest places you can see the cut of a man's cloth is on a sailboat. People say on a golf course, and I'm like, no, on a golf course, people can bullshit you long enough for you to get away with it. But once you're on a sailboat, especially, I'm just, for full disclosure, I am a power boater. I'm not a sailor, even though I've done a lot of sailing. The quick cut through parallels of was actually John Lauren, but Lauren Giles, the designer of your yacht, is that I fell in love with sailboats on something called she was trying to remember, not screw it up, the Sail of Dawn or the Sails of Dawn, a 57-foot Lauren Giles designed yacht. That was actually the last boat he designed before he died. She sits in Malta at the moment, but that was I saw this beautiful boat, and that's why I remember that Setawayo was the same designer. And I love wooden sailboats. I just don't want to maintain them. I mean, it is just so much work. But I've done a lot of sailing actually in Southeast Asia. by pure coincidence of meeting some very, very interesting guys who invited me out on a boat. And next moment I was sailing a 100-foot Kevlar racing yacht from Hong Kong down to Manila Bay and into Port
Was that the Middle Sea race?
Sorry?
Was that the Middle Sea race?
Yeah.
That's a cool race. The China Seas race. The China Seas race.
Yeah, China Seas race. And it was just such a fascinating little entry into that world. But I have been a boater for most of my life. But my next major acquisition is going to be a Bering Explorer yacht built by a Russian guy out of Antalya, Turkey. That is my next thing. With 4,500 nautical miles of range, and I can stay away from these shores for 6 months at a time. That's my next, but that's for another discussion about that later when we have a few
as
drinks.
a sequitur, it's really interesting because as we talk about this, and your affinity is maritime nations are different from landlocked nations because the engagement with the sea is a lateral engagement. So societies that had high coastline ratios to internal volume, like Britain, were highly lateralized. And it's not a surprise that we led the democratic change as the Dutch did, because seafarers are based on meritocracy and capability to survive, and they're lateral because the environment is multi-challenging. Whereas if you look at a large country like Russia, or you go to Iraq, no, they're not going to embrace democracy because they're fundamentally hierarchical and linear and interconnected, and they don't think individually. So I think this concept of lateralization is linked to the rise of democracy and also linked to how autocracies operate in big landlocked structures.
Well, here's another subject that I know that you know a lot about, where I've spent a lot of time. Just think of anybody that you know in Uganda.
Completely landlocked.
Completely landlocked, completely different philosophy of people, and you can never change that. Right. Whereas you look at the the people that I know from the island of Zanzibar, which I know you've been to as well.
Yeah.
Completely different animal. You put those people in the country of Uganda, they will be very, very deeply unhappy, and you can never fix that. And for me, it's been an interesting thing because I grew up as a German in an old German colony. What was then Southwest Africa, Namibia, where nobody swam in the ocean, because if you went to swim in the ocean, you were dead. You know what I mean? Yet I have this absolute love of the water and this exploration where it comes from, and it comes from my ancestors. But let's not get too deep into that. Talk to me about Setawayo. How often do you get to go out and enjoy her? How often do you go sailing? Do you mix it with your business? Do you bring your clients on board? What do you do?
Yeah, so it's multi-dimensional. We race her against other classic boats and modern boats very successfully. She's super competitive. My partner and I sail her together. Brilliant partnership. Have a lot of fun. My family have been brought up on it. So through, the one constant thing they've had is the boat and going sailing with dad in different forms. And I always love taking the right, lateral clients and relationships sailing, because it's amazing how this process of departure from the land, we leave all our clutter behind, and suddenly the real person starts to evolve and connections are made. You can close and discuss business in a way that produces outcomes in the time on the boat. And there's something about the beauty environment that actually appeals to all of us. And the people that come back are very different than the people that left. And I love seeing that, because it's an experience which I live every time. So she's just and also I started with a friend of mine. We started the British Classic Yacht Club of Great Britain, which sounds, it's the first big yacht club in hundreds of years, and it became immensely successful because it was a focus for classic boats to be renovated and raced. Over the past 20 years, it's gone from strength to strength, and it's a beautiful event that brings together wonderful people, beautiful boats. And I was Vice Commodore and Commodore for almost sort of 18 years. And it's one of the things I'm immensely sort of proud of, to see this family, a group of people that now look after their boats, that compete. And if you compete with your boat, you obviously look after it because you've got to go faster. It's a great way of pushing the boat out to make the boats better and keep them alive. So that contribution to the sort of legacy of my heritage was something I really hold dear.
Do you still have those Kevlar sails on her?
Oh,
How did
don't.
that work out?
I upgraded last year to a
Okay.
beautiful set of North 3DLs made of Spectra and Kevlar. And we couldn't get the Kevlar because it all gone to Ukraine for bulletproof jackets. So the damn sails appeared 3 regattas too late, but they are stunning. They got like a straw yellow tone, beautiful shape, boat's never been
Very
faster.
cool.
I put a bigger mast on her too, which people often chastise me for, to make sure that 17.5 tons can move in light breezes.
So what does a guy like you do with a boat like that? Because what are you now, David? How old are you?
60.
60. So how long can you sail till you're
My
85?
ashes, let's get this really straight, Henrik.
Okay.
One prediction I can guarantee you is my ashes are going off the back, right? So I'm not going to let go of it. And to me, that's not the deal. Whether it's my son sailing me, or I'll be in a geriatric state and I find some young guys to go sailing. To me, that's an essential part of being and existing. And I plan to live as long as I'm able to within a society that hopefully continues to make it through the challenges ahead.
Well, interesting about classic yacht clubs. I got to tell you a wonderful, quick little story. So when I decided to propose to Laura Louise, we were, I
Hang
had
on a
my
second,
back.
Henrik, do you really think
Yeah.
you decided?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, absolutely.
And you believe that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Totally.
Oh, she's got a number on you.
Oh yeah. No. I knew within a day that this is how it was going to go.
I've not been facetious about you. It's one of my theories about the initiation of the mating process, that unconsciously men have an omnidirectional radar on their head, and women like singly ping a man when they are in the game, and the man then thinks he does it all. But the truth is, it was always initiated from the other side.
I mean, one of my favorite movies is My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right? Where they're sitting in the diner and they're discussing the whole thing, and the wife is there, and they're like, she goes, the man thinks he's the head, but the woman is the neck that tells the head where to look. You know what I mean? And the lesson is not lost on me. So yes, we'll need some drinks on this. But I decided to, or she decided that I should decide that I should propose. And, it was between New York and we were flying to Hong Kong. Our office was there. Our back office was in Christchurch, New Zealand. We were opening a new office in Sydney, Australia. So I found this beautiful, beautiful boat. It's a sailing yacht, built in 1903. It was at the time the largest sailing boat, called Boomerang. You got to look her up. Yeah,
I know her.
And what a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful boat. But I had to join the Sydney Heritage Yacht Club or something like that in order to actually charter her, because she was only out for charter to members. And I'm like, what's another 25 grand? And when you're in this deep, so I have wonderful, wonderful memories on classic wooden sailing boats. I just don't have the wherewithal to maintain that. And I noticed the one big thing during COVID is, you can have all the private aircraft that you want in the world. If you're in a difficult situation in the world, the first thing they shut down is airspace. You ain't going anywhere. No. The only place where I think you have true freedom of spirit, is out on the ocean. And obviously a sailing yacht is a wonderful thing of freedom, because technically you don't even need fuel, and you can keep going. I am maybe not evolved enough for a sailing yacht. So my big next venture is a major exploration vehicle by which I can go and be an adventurer, for this next chapter of my life, and actually run a business from it. Yeah. And you would be most welcome too, and I'm sure we could
sign me up, Henrik.
Couple of events from that.
Would love to do that. I mean, we've always had a great link. I mean, like a sense of commonality of the different perspective we have in life, and you have a particular energy in communicating to people, which I've always really admired. And your marketing skills are, leave mine standing, because that's one of the weak spots. There is a duality, I think, between the focus of the creation of an underlying understanding, and then how that is explained to other people. And I'm happy to, explain everything that I know to someone that asks, but actually reaching out to people that don't know me, it's actually been podcasts that have been the most persuasive way of doing it.
And, because they're just real conversations. You see, I mean, they're not these orchestrated things. And I always, tell people, especially like in the capital raising process, it's got to be about authentic, engaging conversations, right? But that's not going to help you, but you actually need to create a system. So if you think of your marketing, right, is really about the stories that you want to tell to the people that you wish to serve. You've got to actually create a brand that attracts those people. Like, think of it like a fireplace, right? For centuries, we've been sitting around fire.
And I've listened to you in that process, and I think as we sort of conclude before I have to sadly stop, and we'll go to part 3, I'd love to do it. But essentially, for those listening, I have a construct which explains and predicts things that people don't think possible. It's designed to empower the people, all of you, that if you listen to it. But I can't do this alone. I need engagement and support because our world doesn't have any time left. And so I would make an honest appeal that in terms of resources, support, commitment, we can't get enough in the pile right now. And given those resources, I can think of a way to use the most maximum leverage to make a difference. But I need people to help by actually listening and thinking, whoa, I thought this, I haven't articulated it. I have run out of time. We have run out of time. How do we band together and work together? And so that would be an appeal at the end of this process to basically, we don't have any time left. We need to make sure that this stuff goes to the key lateral decision makers, a few that are left that are ready to act because time's run out.
Yeah, and I get so many kind of requests from people. It's like, all right, so who do I talk to? And obviously, for me, I go, you know what, you got to start following David Murrin. And I actually have some ideas, David, which we can discuss later. I think you need a business partner to really build you a system and create these events so that more people can actually engage with you, and that your zone of genius, which is now clearly defined, can get out and reach more people and reach the right kind of people who can actually take your zone of genius, apply their time, money, and resources, and multiply that effect, right? Because
greater cascade, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, because those ripples that you are creating, I'm literally getting goosebumps as I'm talking about it, because I can visualize the whole thing, because you have these ripples that are going out, but those ripples the momentum needs to be carried forward, which means other people need to take your ideas, your vision, your zone of genius, multiply that with their capital, spread the word by actually doing something about it, right?
That's how I saw Global Forecaster creating a change in the cascade. And one of the things I really love doing, and most of them won't, is I love debating the current frame of mind and thought in leadership and people that think they know how the world works. And not in an adversarial way, but highlight how little they really do understand in part of the process of the need to change. And it isn't meant to be a form of diminishment. It's actually meant a form of challenge. And, people have bumped into me, so they heard you speak 14 years ago. And my first response was, what a load of rubbish. And 24 hours later, I realized you were right. And ever since, I've seen the world differently. So when you engage someone with a different mindset, I don't expect them to pat me on the back immediately. I expect it to be quite a painful interchange initially because you're dislodging or challenging a current set of values. What is really interesting is how many people come back afterwards and go, I've thought of it and it changed everything that I thought afterwards. And if I think of a purpose of, and I do think we're born to have a purpose, I'm not religious, but I'm deeply spiritual. And I think finding the purpose of what you're given and the threads of your gift and expressing them is really important. So you understand me really well when you sense my sense of service, that the knowledge that I've managed to accumulate, I feel I have to share for my purpose, but because I have children and we have children and we need to give them consciously more than we were given, and we're giving them much less right now. And we need to really, really step up.
No, because I can feel this calling too. I have these skills that are in my zone of genius, and they are almost this perfect amplification to yours, because I could help you take your message and really spread it out 100 times out to the world and actually build a system.
And you're doing it now. In effect, this conversation is that particular process, and maybe people will listen to this and say, "I'm interested in how I can partake. I'm interested in what I can do," and then suddenly there's enough, and you can start to use that. But this is a request for interaction for those people that have felt the world is falling underneath them, don't really understand how to articulate how badly, are hearing this and think, wow, action's needed, and stepping up and saying, well, what do we do? You know, there are actions in business, there are foundation structures, there are politicians through connections that this could be addressed to, where they're given completely different tools. We've got to get to the military, and we've got to get to the military to mobilize themselves to adapt to the challenge. Because at the moment, the preeminence of America is deeply under threat through the adaptation of the Chinese system.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, David, shall we leave that here for today? I know you've got a dinner. How much time you got left? Because I know
I'm afraid I'm already bloody late, but you've been so engaging, I couldn't ungrip myself. So thank you very much.
All right, so let's leave it there, and we will come out with a part 3 at some point, and they will be drinking and they will be fighting, and that will just be David and me.
Well, I'm happy to do it next week. I'm happy just to keep the momentum going and see what feedback you've got from these ones. And then, you know, if the people have questions, we can engage in the questions, and it's just a privilege to talk to you.
Well, in the meantime, for anybody that wants to get cracking, you can obviously go to davidmurrin.co.uk. Okay, so that's just David, MURRIN.co.uk, and you can get going there. But I will obviously spread out the links, and I will, before you realize it, I'll put a global event together, and we'll put David and his sorry ass humor in a global event, and you know, let people come get and meet you and all that. That would be a lot of fun, right?
You mean sorry ass and highly irreverent sense of humor. If you, as an Englishman, if you can't laugh at something, then you've obviously got a hard point that needs to be softening.
I am a big fan of self-depreciating humor, but I have a lot of good stuff to work with. So, David, wonderful discussion. Let's leave it right there. Thank you, mate. It was an absolute privilege.
Brilliant. I loved it.
David. Ciao, bye.